Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event. I'm Mary Galvin, the Dean of the College of Science, and on behalf of Tom Fuja, if I may, who's the Dean of the College of Engineering, and Father Terence Ehrman, who's from the Center of Theology, Science, and Human Flourishing, I want to welcome you to tonight's event. It was a snowy day, and we're thrilled that you made it here to talk to us. Before I get into the introduction of Stephen Meredith, I want to make sure I thank quite a few people. Professors Kevin Lannon and Craig Lent, Father Ehrman were really critical in putting this together. They had significant help from Tammy and some others in my office, and so thank you very, very much for what you did to make tonight happen. We also are thrilled that there were others who helped sponsor this. The Center for Theology, Science, and Human Flourishing, the Environmental Change Initiative, the McGrath Institute for Church Life, and the Center for Ethics and Culture. Thank you all, and thank you for coming. Tonight, I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Stephen Meredith. Dr. Meredith is a professor at the University of Chicago, and as you can see, he has an amazing background and depth. He's in the departments of pathology, neurology, biochemistry, and molecular biology. He serves as an associate faculty member in the University of Chicago Divinity School and is the treasurer for the Society of Catholic Scientists. Dr. Meredith is a distinguished researcher. He's published more than 100 journal articles and conducts research on biophysics of protein structure. Throughout his career, he's contributed to multiple studies supported by NIH and the Alzheimer's Association. He's a recipient of numerous awards for teaching, including the Quantrell Award for Undergraduate Teaching, the AOA Award for Teaching Medical Students, and the Burlington and Northern Award for Graduate Education. Dr. Meredith earned his PhD in biochemistry from the University of Chicago and his MD from Washington University in St. Louis. In tonight's lecture, he's going to discuss the ageless problem of evil within the context of illness and suffering. If we are made in the image of God, then how can we account for the occurrence of deadly diseases and the suffering that results from them? Dr. Meredith will turn to the novels of Fyodor Dostoevsky and Thomas Mann and the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas to answer these questions. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Stephen Meredith. Thank you.
Oh, where do I begin? Let's start with thanks also for the invitation to speak here. I'm really delighted to be here. It's been a terrific day. The second thing I want to say is that I will not answer those questions. I don't think anyone ever has, but maybe Thomas Aquinas comes pretty close. The third thing to say is about my voice. If you can't hear me, as I like to say, a surgeon slit my throat. He had my permission, but nevertheless he did, and there was a little complication. So, okay. So tonight's topic is disease and the problem of evil, and Dostoevsky and Mann gave many of their novels subtitles, so I'll give my talk a subtitle as illustrated in the fiction of Dostoevsky and Mann. Now, is this a pointer? Yes, it is. I can think of no better place to start the talk on the problem of evil. Well, here they are. Dostoevsky, here, Mann, those are the dates. And I can think of no better place to start this discussion than to quote from the brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky's last and greatest novel, and in particular, Ivan Karamazov's, one of the three brothers, Ivan's tirade on the suffering of children. So he's talking to his brother Alyosha, who is a novice in the monastery. And he talks, it is a tirade. These educated parents subjected the poor 5-year-old girl to every possible torture. They beat her, flogged her, kicked her, not knowing why themselves, until her whole body was nothing but bruises. Finally, they attained the height of finesse. In the freezing cold, they locked her all night in the outhouse because she wouldn't ask to get up and go in the middle of the night, as if a 5-year-old child sleeping a sound, angelic sleep could have learned to ask by that age. For that, they smeared her face with her excrement and made her eat her excrement. And it was her mother, who made her. And this mother could sleep while her poor little child was moaning all night in that vile place. Can you understand that a small creature who cannot even comprehend what is being done to her in a vile place, in the dark and in the cold, beats herself on her strained little chest with her tiny fist and weeps with her anguished, gentle, meek tears for dear God to protect her? Can you understand such nonsense, my friend and brother, my godly and humble novice? Can you understand why this nonsense is needed and created? Without it, they say, man could not have lived on earth, for he would not have known good and evil. Who wants to know this damned good and evil at such a price? The whole world of knowledge is not worth the tears of that little child to dear God. Now, I'm thinking a lot about Ivan Karamazov, first of all, because I do anyway, but also because this quarter I happen to be teaching a course devoted to the brothers Karamazov. And as a matter of fact, this the chapter of this the title of this chapter of the novel, it's entitled Rebellion. It happened to be the first thing I ever read by Dostoevsky. And it was also the first thing I ever read on the problem of evil. I guess you could say it made quite an impression. I read this while I was a first-year college student taking Philosophy 101. It was for the 1 week of the course spent on the problem of evil. And we used a book called God and Evil by an theologian by the name of Nelson Pike. It's a selection of writings on the topic. And this chapter was the first chapter in that book. So it obviously made quite an impression on Nelson Pike as well. Now, Ivan Karamazov's problem, at least as he sees it, is that God has given him only a poor human three-dimensional mind, or as he puts it, a Euclidean mind, that cannot comprehend the possibility of an eventual reconciliation with a God who would create a world with so much evil in it. When I first read this chapter, I remember thinking to myself, wow, what a great argument for atheism. Well, little did I know at the time that Dostoevsky was anything but an atheist. He was, in fact, a devout Christian. The theologian Hans Kung has said that the problem of evil is the rock upon which atheism is founded. I'm not so sure that that's correct in general, but it was certainly true for Ivan Karamazov. Dostoevsky took an enormous artistic risk by giving Ivan such incredibly powerful speeches. This is just a sample, so I urge you to read the whole thing. Dostoevsky wrote in his letters and diaries that the entire novel was intended as a response to Ivan's attack. But the artistic risk was that the respondents, his brother Alyosha and the saintly elder Father Zosima, they never get to respond in kind to Ivan. There's no fiery tirade on behalf of God. There is only a kind of quiet leading by example and enacting what Zosima called active love. The love of the Gospels, which tells us to love God and love our neighbors as ourselves. And the important point is neighbors, not necessarily people at a distance, but people even close to us. Ivan was a lover of humanity too, but here's the difference. Ivan's love is theoretical and abstract. He loves humanity at a distance, not close up. Up close, he seems to scorn most people most of the time. Not always, so there is some hope for him. But most of the time, he is a very angry young man. And incidentally, he had been trained in the natural sciences at the university, which you heard from Father Ehrman's homily today. In the 19th century, science and religion became supposed enemies, which of course they are really not. Anyway, in contrast, Alyosha, who does not talk about children, actually engages with children, actually helps them out in a very specific and concrete way. Father Zosima had, in fact, acted that way to Alyosha. Zosima preached that we are all responsible to all, that we need to take the burden of guilt for the world on ourselves, and this is the essence of active love. The point, I'd say, is that the characters in the novel are almost infectious, for good or ill. Zosima set out on his religious life through the influence of his saintly brother Markel, who was dying of tuberculosis when Zosima was only 8 years old. This brother, Markel, ends his life in the manner of St. Francis, viewing the world in almost paradisical terms and apologizing to the birds. From Markel, the love got transmitted to Zosima, and then, who was then known as Zinovi. And then from Zosima, it went to Alyosha, and from Alyosha to the young boys he helps. In contrast, Ivan's negative view of the world infects other characters as well. In one in particular, who is Smerdyakov, who's always referred to as the lackey Smerdyakov. It's not that Dostoevsky was putting down the lower classes, quite the contrary, in fact. But Smerdyakov's soul was the small soul, the lackey soul, mean-spirited all the time. In Ivan's view, Smerdyakov was useful only as cannon fodder for the coming socialist revolution, rather prescient of Dostoevsky, who finished the novel in 1877. Now, the problem I would like to address comes from the fact that some of us, maybe many of us, maybe most of us, are not so fortunate as Alyosha. Many or most of us are perhaps like Ivan, and we constantly ask the question, which I myself, another Ivan, I ask the students in my class, which ones of you are like Ivan, which are like Dmitri, which are like Alyosha. Almost all of them are like Ivan. But anyway, we constantly ask this question: why does God allow children to suffer? For whatever reason, I find it difficult, indeed impossible, to be reconciled to this fact. I'm pretty sure that that was the same thing for Dostoevsky as well. Dostoevsky, by the way, declares Alyosha, not Ivan. Even though Ivan dominates a lot of the action, he declares Alyosha to be the hero of his novel. Now, my particular problem has to do with disease, what it is and why it occurs, not in the sense of pathophysiology, which in a certain distant way my scientific work involves, but in the philosophical and theological sense of those questions. And I find fiction very helpful in addressing questions like this. So I'd like to turn now to another author, that's Thomas Mann. Now I want to, the reason I'm bringing Mann into this is that he had a particular obsession with disease. Here is a brief survey of the writings of Thomas Mann about disease. And you can see practically everything he wrote revolves around some disease. This is a partial list. Any of these works will tell us quite a bit about disease and the problem of evil. But I want to turn to one of his works in particular, The Magic Mountain. Now, as you probably know, The Magic Mountain takes place in a tuberculosis sanitarium in the Swiss Alps, somewhat modeled after a sanatorium at which Mann's wife stayed for 6 weeks at Davos, and Mann visited her there and almost became a patient himself. The protagonist of The Magic Mountain is named Hans Castorp, and he incorporates many autobiographical features of the author. He goes to the International Sanatorium Berghof in Davos Platz to visit his seriously ill cousin, Joachim Ziemßen. Hans intended the visit, which started in 1907, he intended the visit to last 3 weeks. And the 3 weeks were until he would begin his scheduled job as an engineer in a shipbuilding firm. He ends up staying for 7 years. And when the novel ends, he is last seen on a battlefield of the Great War, or as we now call it, World War I, his fate unknown. Okay, what kind of a disease is tuberculosis anyway? And again, I'm not speaking of microbiology or pathophysiology. In addition to being a disease of the body, it is, for Mann, certainly, an inward manifestation of a disease of the soul. And that's how he treated disease in general. I think I would like to mention 4 features that I think define Mann's concept of disease, by which I mean that the physical disease serves as a manifestation of the disease of a disease of the soul. So the first is that the disease is hidden. It's a secret. Not only in showing the state of the soul, it's a secret in that sense, but also in its physical manifestations. It's also a hidden process. Thus, disease gets uncovered and discovered throughout the course of the novel. In The Magic Mountain, Hans Castorp is genuinely amazed, as well he should have been, by the ability to look inside himself through the use of a new invention, X-rays, quite a novelty in 1907. Indeed, he carries an inner portrait, a chest X-ray, of his sometime girlfriend, Claudia Chauchat, along with him. Now he refers to these X-rays, he refers to them as internal portraits. But they're also metaphors, clearly metaphors. They reveal the inner and secret disease, and that is likened to the psychoanalytic process of unearthing unconscious thoughts and feelings. And indeed, in the novel, this comparison is made explicitly. There is, in fact, a psychoanalyst named Dr. Krakowski at the sanitarium. Mann had a great affinity with psychoanalysis, and he wrote an important essay on Freud. Okay, the second trait, the second feature, is that the disease is sought after. Okay? However gruesome the disease, it is also something that the character wants, actively, passively seeks. It fulfills a wish. Now, this doesn't mean it's fun and pleasant. But again, we turn to Freud. The neurotic patient is not malingering, but the neurotic symptom nevertheless fulfills some unconscious wish. And in that sense, even if the neurotic symptom does a great deal of harm to the patient, in that sense, neurotic symptoms for Freud were like dreams. Dreams are not always conventionally pleasant, but they are also somehow the fulfillment of a wish. The goal of psychoanalysis was to bring the wish from unconsciousness to consciousness. For Mann's diseased characters, disease has this characteristic of a neurotic symptom, that whatever harm the disease does, it is also sought for and fulfills some unconscious wish. The third feature is that the disease is some kind of decay. Words like decay and decadent are very slippery, very loaded, but I mean that the characters view their disease as a manifestation of decay. That is, from a healthier and more virtuous past state. Disease, therefore, becomes a kind of fall from grace and indicates an inner moral rottenness. Mann's first novel, which was entitled Budenbrooks, and when he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, that was the novel that was specifically cited. Budenbrooks was subtitled The Decline of a Family. So it's all about decline and decay. In The Magic Mountain, Mann plays with the height of the Alps by declaring them also to be a descent into Hades, where Rhadamanthus, who is that's the nickname for the head physician, Dr. Behrens, he has dominion over Hades in Greek mythology and other mythology. It's also a fall for Hans Castorp from the stolid North German burgher life. He's a budding engineer, after all, in a shipping firm. It's a decline from that into the slovenly ways of art and philosophy. And indeed, much of Mann's earlier fiction, for example, his novella, Tonio Kruger, tells about an artist who comes from an upper middle class background, which Mann did, and has a bad conscience about the slovenly and dissolute ways of artists. I'm using that in quotes, by the way. There's a definite sense of shame in these artists, who are, as one friend of Tonio Kruger called him, he is a bourgeois manqué. So early in The Magic Mountain, Hans' doughty uncle Tinapel visits Hans at the sanitarium and then flees in panic. He flees, it's strongly implied, because he does not want to fall into the seductive decadence of the mountain. And finally, disease is also something for which the characters feel guilty. It occurs through a failure of vigilance and discipline. It is something succumbed to, slovenly again, as in the German children's stories Struwwelpeter. Now, here's a picture of Struwwelpeter, which is described here as a funny and droll stories with 15 beautifully colored plates for children of 3 to 6 years. My editorial to you, never, ever show this to a child. Okay. So for Mann, in particular, this sense about feeling guilty and succumbing to urges through a failure of vigilance and discipline, this is related for him to what he referred to as his homoerotic urges. Although these urges appear in subliminal form in his writings, he was quite explicit about them in his diaries, and his diaries appeared in unexpurgated form 20 years after his death in 1975. Now, Hans Castorp is first described as a mediocre, einfacher, mittelmaßig young man. As his stay is continually prolonged for 7 years, he first denies that he belongs in the sanitarium, and then gradually becomes accustomed to it, even dependent upon the ways of the mountain. This mediocre man will prove to be not entirely mediocre. He'll have some flashes of brilliance, though not often and not for long. Now, one such flash of brilliance occurs in a chapter called Walpurgis Night, which is, a carnival feast in Germany, in which, in the carnival atmosphere, he is permitted to speak not in ordinary language, but he speaks in French, entirely in French, to this girl, Claudia Schochat, who is this slovenly, artsy Slavic woman. Mann plays here with a Spenglerian construct. History moves, if you will, to the west. And hence, Germans, as Mann saw them, are people of the middle, between what he portrayed as the morally lax east from which Claudia comes, and the stern west of Spain. Now, I don't think we need to dwell so much on this socio-political construct, which I would like to believe Mann used mainly to set up the dynamic between Hans and Claudia. Hans, in fact, shudders at her loose ways. She even bites her fingernails, for crying out loud. But he's attracted to her. Well, fair enough, why not? But when Hans falls for her, it's a giving in to decadence and waywardness. And yet, Mann, who is a constant ironist, gives us hints that she's really not that much of a slut and not as immoral or amoral as Hans takes her to be. In fact, we need to be honest about our young hero, Hans Castorp. He's rather a bit of a prig. He's rather pompous, and as we'd say now, a real tight ass. Is it really necessary, as he does, to change one's shirt twice a day and then have them sent to Hamburg to be ironed because no one here can do it right? Is it really necessary for one's socks to be monogrammed? Well, Hans does manage to fall and lighten up. But my point is that there's a part of him that wants to fall in this way. He's seduced by the mountain, metaphorically speaking. This mountain, which is also a descent into licentiousness with Claudia. So early in his stay at the sanitarium, Hans discovers that he too has a spot of tuberculosis on his lungs. But the spot is not only tuberculosis, it is also, for him, a token of original sin. The spot ties him to the broader humanity of the International Sanitarium Berghof, but it is also, to some extent, a desired fall. Now, his desired fall has precedents, but I want to discuss one of them, which is this one, and that is his early experience of death. Hans's parents both died when he was a young boy, and then he went to live with his grandfather, and his grandfather is a stately old man who also, while Hans is young, dies. And here is when his grandfather dies, Mann tells us about Hans's view of death, which is very close to his view of disease. And so I'm going to read this quote here. Analyzed and put into words, his feelings might have been expressed as follows. There was something religious, gripping, and sadly beautiful, which was to say, spiritual about death, and at the same time, something that was the direct opposite, something very material, physical, which one could not really describe as beautiful or gripping or religious or even as sad. The religious, spiritual side was expressed by the pretentious lying in state, by the pomp of flowers and palm fronds, which he knew signified heavenly peace, and also, more to the point, by the cross between the dead fingers of what had been his grandfather, by the blessings, a copy of Thorvaldsen's Christ extended from the head of the coffin, and by two towering candelabras on either side, which on occasion like this also took on an ecclesiastical character. The explicit and well-intended purpose of all these arrangements was apparently to show that grandfather had now passed on forever to his authentic and true form. But they also served another purpose, one that little Hans likewise noted, if not admitting it to himself in so many words. In particular, the masses of flowers, and more especially the very well represented tuberoses, were there for a more sobering reason. And that was to gloss over the other side of death, the one that is neither beautiful nor sad, but almost indecent in its base physicality, to make people forget it, or at least not be reminded of it. Now, the tuberoses, well, what else would they be in this novel? Obviously, tuberoses. They were there to cover the stench of death. And Mond was very fond of doubles, all right, as you can see in this passage. There's also Felix Krull, the hero of Mond's late comic masterpiece, The Confessions of Felix Krull, and Krull called them duplicities because there was an element of getting fooled by them. Death and disease are not the physical or the spiritual, they are the physical and the spiritual. And also, note the relation to art, because Felix Krull, the full title is The Confessions of Felix Krull, Confidence Man. So he's a con man. For Felix, the crime, con man aspect of it, it's not about the money, but it's about the art, the beauty of it. Crime is, for Krull, an aesthetic attitude. Felix Krull was Mond's last novel, by which time I think he was perhaps finally comfortable enough to admit that yes, he was indeed an artist and not a shipbuilder like Hans Castorp's forebears or a grain merchant like his own. As a boy, Felix Krull got taken to the theater by his father. Felix absolutely loved it, and this launched him on his career of crime. And it so happens that his father knew the star, who had the absurd name Mueller-Rosé, okay? This kind of crazy hybrid name. Now, after the performance, Felix's father took him backstage to meet Mueller-Rosé. Mueller-Rosé was seated at the grubby dressing table in front of a dusty, speckled mirror. He had nothing on but a pair of gray cotton drawers, and a man in shirt sleeves was massaging his back, the sweat running down his own face. Meanwhile, the actor was busy wiping face and neck with a towel already stiff with rouge and grease paint. Half of his countenance still had the rosy coating that made him radiant on the stage, but now looked merely pink and silly in contrast to the cheese-like pallor of his natural complexion. He had taken off the chestnut wig, and I saw that his own hair was red. One of his eyes still had black shadows beneath it, and metallic dust clung to the lashes. The other was inflamed and watery and squinted at us impudently. All this I might have borne, but not the pustules with which Mueller-Rosé's back, chest, shoulders, and upper arms were thickly covered. They were horrible pustules, red-rimmed, suppurating, some of them even bleeding. Even today, I cannot repress a shudder at the thought of them. That's great. That's so good. So Mueller-Rosé, he's a half and half. He is Mueller, German for related to the word for dullard, and rosé. Okay, so so he's both at the same time. And by the way, I am guessing, I haven't seen this said, but I think it's true, that the pustules represent lesions of secondary syphilis. But the point is the duplicity, like his face, like his name. This is a good thing. This is a good thing. The fraud is good. This is art. It's a kind of fraud. It's a duplicity in which the real world is duplicated in a duplicitous manner in the work of art, in an artistic rendering. Fiction, indeed, is a fake, and that's good. So that brings me back to the Magic Mountain and how all this might relate to the problem of evil. The main double or duplicity in the Magic Mountain is a pair of potential mentors for Hans Castorp's mind and soul, Ludovico Settembrini and Leo Napta. Few brief words. Settembrini is the self-appointed spokesman for enlightenment and reason, but he's also a bit of a cartoon. And Hans Castorp thinks of him with a somewhat racist trope as an organ grinder. Rather unfortunate. But he's forever tootling on his penny whistle of reason and progress. Naphtha is his intellectual opponent, and interestingly, he arrives on the mountain the day after Claudia departs. Now, in contrast to Settembrini's enlightenment, Naphtha gives us darkness. It's a kind of depth, perhaps, but in the end, it's an impossible and indigestible mess. He is contradiction itself. There could be no other end for him but suicide, which in fact is his end. He is a Jewish Jesuit, a luxuriant ascetic, a reactionary communist, and above all, a proto-fascist. He rejects umbrellas as the paragon of bourgeois mediocrity and softness, yet he's too ill, too weak to live even the physically undemanding life of an academic. However, I have to add that the elevators in one of the buildings was out, so I want to say that maybe the academic life isn't all that undemanding after all. But anyway, he delights in his illness, and he's one of the many grotesques in Mann's fictions. Now, the word grotesque has come to mean a kind of sardonic humor that is improper, distorted, and unnatural. As Sir Thomas Browne wrote in Religio Medici, there are no grotesques in nature. And what this implies is that where you find a grotesque, it is somehow unnatural. So, and yet, as Mann lets us know, Mann became a staunch defender, surprisingly so, given his background, of the Weimar Republic, and later a great foe of Hitler in the Third Reich. So he describes, he knows the appeal of irrationalism and totalitarianism to ordinary people like Hans Castorp. Not only here, but also in his wonderful story, Mario and the Magician. Now, the second point I want to make about Naphtha and Settembrini requires some introduction to the problem of evil, and I'm going to introduce it here and talk more about it later. So Mann uses disease as a surrogate for evil. But what exactly is evil? What exactly do we mean by evil? Now, to Augustine and Aquinas, and in my opinion, to Mann as well, evil does not have a nature or an essence of its own. It's real enough in the pain that it causes, but it can exist only parasitically within something else that does have a nature or essence. Now, to give a simple physical example, think about tooth decay. Tooth decay in the absence of tooth makes no sense whatsoever. Now, to state the problem of evil, this is one statement of it from the 5th century Augustinian philosopher and poet Boethius on the consolation of philosophy. He wrote this: if God exists, whence evil? All right? Now, everybody cites that line. But if you look at the poem, it actually has a second line that people usually leave out, and it's just as important, which is, if God does not exist, if not, whence the good? So let me fill this out slightly more. If God exists and is all-powerful and all good, why is there evil in the world? Okay, so now, and this is the answer of Augustine. I'm not going to read it all in the interest of time, but this is a formula culled from a lot of authors. But evil is the privation of the good in a subject. Two important points to note about that. It's a privation. It's something that ought to be there and isn't. It's not a simple negation. So it's evil for a man to be blind, but not evil for a stone to be blind. It's not evil for a man to be unable to fly, because that doesn't belong to his nature. And second is that evil is in a subject. What's a subject? Well, it's something that is part of a sentence. You can think about it grammatically, but it's also something that could say of itself, I am a subject. All right? Very brief in the interest of time. Now, Okay, so when Naptha and Settembrini do battle for the soul and mind of Hans Castorp, in a way they are doing battle for the mind and soul of Germany. Would it be guided by enlightened principles or by the forces of darkness? Let me add that Mann was not an optimist on this point. Settembrini had introduced Castorp, Hans Castorp to Naptha rather reluctantly. And after one particularly repulsive tirade from Naptha, he warns his young charge, Hans, against Naptha. At first, Settembrini's warning is rather restrained, but he does have moments of clarity and perspicacity when he rises above himself, as it were. So there's a chapter in the novel significantly entitled The City of God and Evil Deliverance. And here's what Settembrini says to Hans about Naptha. Gentlemen, I would like to warn you about the person whose guest we just were, Naptha, and to whom I introduced you very much against my will and intentions. As you know, chance wished it otherwise. I could not help it, but I bear the responsibility, and it weighs heavily on me. It is at the very least my duty to point out to you as young people certain intellectual risks you run in associating with that man, and to beg you, moreover, to keep your relations with him within certain prudent limits. His form is logic, but his nature is confusion. And what does that sound like? It doesn't sound necessarily only like a human being. Hans Castorp acts very coyly. He pretends not to understand this warning. And remember, Hans is attracted to evil, like young Augustine in the Confessions is attracted to evil in the theft of the pears. But because of Hans's coy reaction, Settembrini elaborates a little more. And I call the attitude that Settembrini warns against, I call it the reification of evil, making evil into a thing in its own right. He says, gentlemen, Herr Settembrini continued now, stepping very near the young men, spreading his thumb and middle finger of his left hand into a wide fork, as if to concentrate their attention, and raising the forefinger of his right hand in warning. Imprint this on your minds. The intellect is sovereign. Its will is free. It defines the moral world. If it isolates death in a dualistic fashion, then by that act of intellectual will, death becomes real in actual fact. Actu, do you understand? It becomes a force of its own, opposed to life, an antagonistic principle, a great seduction. Now, the issue in this quote is the nature of evil, or rather, whether evil has a nature. Settembrini, in discussing death, finds himself in odd agreement with Augustine and Thomas Aquinas in arguing that death and disease are not self-subsistent things, but rather the privation of good in a subject. To see death as a force on its own, opposed to life, an antagonistic principle, is not merely a metaphysical trap, it is also, as Settembrini puts it, a great seduction. So, if you haven't read the novel, spoiler alert, please cover your ears. As time goes on, weeks turn into months, which turn into years. The mood of the mountain turns into ennui, and the debates between Naptha and Settembrini get more and more strident and raucous, and eventually, if one looks carefully, they even begin sometimes to swap positions. But it all ends grotesquely in a duel. Settembrini takes his pistol and fires harmlessly into the air. So that's, if you will, a knock against the so-called shallowness of enlightenment. But, the organ grinder aspect of him. But it is clearly preferable to what Naptha does, which is he shoots himself in the head. It's not clear that, and Mann makes it very clear, that whatever is the weakness of Settembrini's stance is far preferable to Naphtha's. And it's not clear that Hans would be convinced by Settembrini, despite the basic decency of this young man. And as I say, we last see him going off to the battlefields in World War I, his fate unknown. Okay, so I want to now return to the privation theory of evil and discuss it a little more fully. And then to summarize, well, I gave the inexact quote, due diligence. Here are the exact quotes if you want to look it up. But I'm not going to spend the time to go over it. But the trouble, it seems, that we have with evil, the trouble is this troublesome little verb here. Okay, is, state of being verbs. Thomas Aquinas' first book, probably his first book, called On Being in Essence, he says a little mistake in the beginning turns into a big one in the end. And the little mistake is over this little word, state of being, essa in Latin, if you will. And that is that it's really two words, but we use the same word for both. Okay? The first is a grammatical copulative. Now, when we say the sky is blue, we don't mean that the sky is blueness itself, the color blue, that it is the color blue. We mean that it has the quality of a blue color. All right? That's a grammatical copulative that joins together the subject and predicate. But state of being can also be a statement of essence. For example, essence is what the thing is. Okay, the definition of the thing in brief. So God is the source of all love. Well, he really is that. Okay? So that's an equation. God is that. Okay? So the problem is that when we talk about evil, we say that disease is evil. But we don't mean that disease is actu. We mean that disease has the property of being evil. All right? So I want to consider the privation theory of evil and some possible objections to it. So the first objection to it, I think, is just not a valid one, and I'm not going to spend much time on it, but it's actually the one that when I teach a course on the problem of evil, it's the one students come up with most often, which is, I'll get a student in the class to say, you're telling me that there's no evil in the world, that everything's great. No, I'm not. I'm really not. I've gone through medical school. It's not all good. All right? In many ways, I mean that. And, pick up a newspaper. This is what Dostoevsky did when he wrote The Brothers Karamazov. Those stories from Ivan are all from Russian newspapers in the 1850s and 60s. But now let me turn to what I think are somewhat more substantial objections. And the first one is this one, that it fails to give a sufficient account of the vividness of suffering and the glaring nature of evil. Now, to put a philosophical name on it, this argument is a phenomenological argument. It says that the phenomenon has primacy over explanations of phenomena. So consider now this quote from an author, is the privation theory of evil dead? And I think maybe he thinks it is, although I don't agree. But in it, he contrasts a numb or paralyzed finger to one that's throbbing with pain. And he says, pain is not simply the absence of feeling or pleasure. It is a positively bad sensation or feeling from, again, a phenomenological point of view. A privation theorist might argue that pain is just a lack of pleasure, even though it appears to be its own phenomenological appearance. Now, let me mention in passing that I taught medical students their course on cellular pathology for about 20 years and had a lot of fun challenging them and myself to see whether I could describe disease as a privation. And I just want to say that on the scientific level, this works amazingly well. You'd be surprised, or maybe you'll be surprised. For example, think about an infiltrating cancer. Like the throbbing finger, it has this positively nasty aspect to it. And yet, this tumor is in fact one that has lost the ability to limit its growth to within tissue limits. And this, in fact, can now be explained in terms of specific disease-causing mutations in the cancer, which prevent the cancer from downregulating growth. Remember, biological processes need not only to be turned on, at some point they also need to be turned off. So the genes regulating tissue growth, cell division, and the like are often mutated in cancers. So it seems like an increase in growth, or the increase in the production of a protein, for example. This is best explained as a deficiency of a regulatory gene or gene product. Okay, now, to come back to this author's problem, I think his problem is that he seems to, he starts off phenomenologically, but he wants to end with explanation. And he seems to confuse or mistake privation for passivity, which it is not. And this is not valid, and Thomas Aquinas, in fact, answered this. This is Summa Theologica, Part 1, Question 49, Article 1. I'm not going to read the whole thing in the interest of time. I have a slide next that summarizes the main points. But he starts out with this. He parses out. It's a very typically Thomistic parsing out. So he says, here's the summary slide. So evil can be caused by a defect in action. So this can be in the part of the agent or in the effect. So consider a weak child can't lift something, or a fire, a weak fire that doesn't warm, or a person with what he called lameness, we now call a disability. These are defects in the agent, and then there can be a defect in the effect, like you have a perfectly good fire, but the wood is wet, and you can't light it. And then there's evil caused in things, where the agent is just fine, it acts properly, and in that case, and this is the point about disease, the evil done is what he called accidental, and I mean that in the Aristotelian Thomistic sense. The fire does not aim at the privation of the form of water, but at the bringing in of its own form, though by doing this, it also accidentally harms the other. Now, instead of talking about fire and air and water, let's talk about human beings and Mycobacterium tuberculosis, like in the Magic Mountain. M. tuberculosis doesn't aim to harm the human being, it aims to grow. It aims to perfect its own form. Human beings are harmed per accidens. That does not mean that the harm done is illusory or doesn't exist, but that's how it comes about, per accidens. Now, the harm, in fact, to put it another way, the harm comes about because the world has competition in it. There's competition between M. tuberculosis and Homo sapiens. It just so happens that the world is that way. And this ought not to come as a shock to evolutionary biologists who talk about competition all the time. And yet it does. They look at this and they say, well, how can there be a God? Some of them do that. How can there be a God when he allows that to occur? Here's Thomas Aquinas telling us that that's just what does occur. Now, let me turn to the next argument about, in criticism of the privation theory of evil, that it's just as valid to say that good is the privation of evil as to say that evil is the privation of the good. Now, I don't know if the author of this article, here's a quote, I'm not going to read it, but it's from the same article. I don't know if this author considers this to be a novel argument, but let me tell you, it is not. It's Manichaeism, pure and simple. And there's an ethical problem with Manichaeism, among other dualistic philosophies that look upon the world as a battleground between good and evil, duking it out against one another. The problem is that it ultimately becomes very arbitrary which one you say is good and which one you say is evil. It flattens the moral landscape. And let me give you an example. If you think Manichaeism is dead, think again. The dark and light side of the forces are Manichaeism. Why do we think the light side of the force is good? Well, maybe there are some Darth Vader fans out there. I don't know. But most of us are supposed to root for Luke Skywalker. Why is Luke good? Well, George Lucas tells us he's good. The music, there's a lot of light. The music is in a major key when Luke is around. It's in a minor key when Darth Vader is around. But those aren't really very good reasons, are they? So is there any real reason to privilege the light and dark side of the force? And so that leads to a flattening, ultimately, of the moral landscape. And that was, I think, the gist of one of Augustine's main arguments against Manichaeism. Now, there have been philosophical and scientific attempts either to go beyond good and evil, read Nietzsche, or to explain morality away in terms of evolution, arguing that things like good and evil, altruism and selfishness can all be reduced to evolutionary advantage and disadvantage. I might add, by the way, that trying to do this, even within the context of pure evolutionary biology, turns out to be a lot harder than one might guess. Defining what is an evolutionary advantage is not so straightforward. But I don't know if they realize that there's some of these authors, read Richard Dawkins, claim, not realizing the inconsistency in their statement, that they claim that we can still have morality, even while arguing that there are selfish genes, and that it can all be reduced to evolutionary advantage. It's not just internally inconsistent, but I think the other thing that they don't realize about their argument is that it's not about morality at all. It's about economics, okay? And a lot of philosophical arguments about the problem of evil sometimes veer off into economics rather than philosophy. Now, I'm not going to stop to give this argument here, but I want to come to the third and what I consider to be the most valid argument against the privation theory of evil, and that is malice. Malice is acting with an intentionally bad, an intentionally bad will, the will to do harm. In other words, malice, cruelty. And this is, I think, the essence of Ivan Karamazov's complaint. He speaks of the unredeemed suffering of children, and he says this: I don't want harmony. For the love of mankind, I don't want it. I want to remain with unrequited suffering. I'd rather remain with my unrequited suffering and my unquenched indignation, even if I am wrong. Besides, they have put too high a price on harmony. We can't afford to pay so much for admission to heaven. And therefore, I hasten to return my ticket. And it is my duty, if only as an honest man, to return it as far ahead of time as possible, which is what I'm doing. It's not that I don't accept God, Alyosha. I just most respectfully return him the ticket. Now, this, to use the proper term, is what is known as morose delectation. It is the willful dwelling upon impure thoughts. Even if there were harmony and it could be proven to him, Ivan would reject it. Ivan argues that it's not God that he rejects, it's the world created by God. But is it really possible to accept God without accepting the world he created? In discussing cases of moral depravity and malice, Ivan declares here that he is returning the ticket to God. Now, I want to give a qualified assent to what Yvonne is saying here. And I'm going to do it briefly because I'm going to run out of time if I don't. And that is that even Thomas Aquinas endorses this position with respect to malice. He says, within the domain of morals, evil is asserted in a positive way. He's talking about language, how we speak about good and evil. Good and evil are not constitutive differences. You have evil or privation, not good and evil as opposites. So good and evil are not constitutive differences except in morals, which receive their species from the end, which is the object of the will. So in malice and cruelty, the will goes to a bad end. And again, good and evil in moral matters are opposed as contraries. All right, but, why it's qualified. In the end, even this is a type of privation, because even moral evils provide a kind of privation. The evil of fault, intentionally doing wrong things, consists in the privation in the order of an act, in a voluntary species, in species that have free will, like us and the angels. Okay. Last part of my talk, I want to come to. Let me see. Yeah, here we are. Okay, I want to end this talk with what I consider to be some challenges from biology to how we as Catholics think about disease and death, particularly about disease. I think that we need to prepare ourselves for an onslaught from biology, because biology is in its infancy. Physics is, at this point, a fairly mature science, but biology is still in its infancy. And I think the reason we need to prepare ourselves is that the science, well, at least some of it, is going to be valid. Even if the attempts at philosophy by the biologists may not be. Okay, so the first challenge is this. Thomas Aquinas related disease, our proneness, disease, and death to original sin. And he's not alone in this. Augustine did much the same thing. So is it proper to relate disease even to original sin? And if that's the case, here's the question from biology. If that's the case, why do animals get diseases? All right? Now I want to answer this question, my own question, with a qualified yes, it is valid. But here's the hesitation, which is about the nature of original sin as we usually think about it, is the misuse of our freedom. But according to Thomas Aquinas, animals do not have free will. They are, as he referred to them somewhat dismissively, brute animals, and indeed most philosophers before the mid-20th century did that. But they don't have free will, and so they can't misuse what they don't have. Now, Thomas Aquinas gave an answer about disease, and it comes from an unexpected source, perhaps, from the book of Job. And this is an engraving. William Blake, as some of you may know, was not only a great poet, but a great artist who did his own engravings for works like the Book of Job. But Thomas Aquinas distanced himself from the interlocutors, the so-called friends of Job, who tried to tie Job's suffering, including his illness, to his individual sins. And that was the problem for Aquinas. And here I'm talking about, so the problem here is that modern biology has amply demonstrated the unity of the biome. Here's a statement from Job, Eliphaz the Temanite, who argues, if you're suffering, you must have done something wrong. And Thomas Aquinas says, if it were true as Eliphaz was trying to claim, that the proper punishment of sins were the adversities of the present life, like disease, it would follow that men would suffer grave adversities because of grave sins and light adversities because of light sins. And so just men would never be subjected to grave adversities, which is patently false. Same thing with children. Temporal adversity is not the proper punishment for sins. And as he says, the discussion in the whole book will generally concern this point about the book of Job, his commentary on Job. Okay, I'll skip this in the interest of time. Now, there's a point I want to make here about animals and children. And here's another quote from Brothers Karamazov. Ivan says, I will not speak of grown-ups, this is the same conversation with Alyosha, apart from the fact that they are disgusting and do not deserve love. It's a little too strong, I think. They also have retribution, which means they're going to get punished if they do badly. They ate the apple and knew good and evil and became as gods. They still go on eating it. But little children have not eaten anything and are not yet guilty of anything. Now, I just want to point out that this is not how Augustine thought about original sin. There is a difference between the Eastern and Western churches. In the Eastern Church, the Orthodox churches, original sin is the tendency to enter the world in its corrupt ways. And so you grow more sinful as you enter the world. And I find this a kind of a comforting way to look at things. Now, a related point is this. There's the unity of the biome. And what do these all have in common? Here we have a banana. Here we have two human beings with one brain. And here we have a little worm called C. elegans. By the way, in case you're wondering, that's the head. So what do they have in common? Roughly 35% of their genes. For the C. elegans, it's more like 50%. But for the banana, it's about 35%. And there are homologs, another figure, 60% of genes encoding. But the problem, why the number varies, is it's hard to define a homolog. But in any case, this cute little fellow, this chimpanzee, he shares roughly 98.5% of our DNA. So is the human being to be defined by DNA? And this one I just love. I gotta do something here. Oh, I don't know if this is going to work. Didn't work. Didn't work. There's a there's a movie that shows it swimming, and it never works when you want it to. Oh, wait a second, I got to show this to you. This is so cool. Okay, wait, here, I can do it this way. Isn't that amazing? It's utterly amazing. Okay, well, let's get back to the point. So the question is, do animals suffer? And if so, why? And C.S. Lewis wrote this book, The Problem of Pain, and he says, no, not really. They don't really suffer. Oh yeah, you give them a noxious stimulus and they'll react with aversive behavior, but they don't really have memory in our sense. They don't really have consciousness in our sense, and so they don't really suffer. Well, the amazing thing here is that Lewis himself was an animal lover. But I have to say, with all due respect to this terrific writer, that I think he's just plain wrong. There's it's not just the large part of the genome that we share, it's also the large part of our nervous system. And while it might be true that that higher mammals don't experience suffering in quite the same way we do, I think it's just incorrect to say simply that they have no sense of time or consciousness. That's not exactly true. I want to consider this quote. No, not this one. Yeah, this one from Mary Midgley, who's written a lot on this topic. So if you want to read about the bioethics of animals, I recommend her. She's quoting a passage, she's commenting on a passage from Darwin on the descent of man. And she says, on Darwin's suggestion, the relation of the natural social motives to morality would be much like the relation of natural curiosity to mathematics and science, or the relation of natural wonder and admiration to art, or that of natural amusability to jokes. These natural motives do not of themselves create arts and institutions that channel them, but they provide a certain appropriate motivational force that is necessary to create these channels, and they also determines, sometimes in surprising ways, the direction that force will take. So we see in animals kind of the form fruit of the things that we consider typically human. Okay, second problem from biology is, can biology teach us anything about original sin? And in this above quote from Mary Midgley on Darwin, she recognizes that animals don't do science and art, but they seem to have some kind of precursor to that. And I was rather heartened by the quote from from Pope Francis, saying, "One day we will see our animals again in the eternity of Christ. Paradise is open to all of God's creatures." I mean, I don't know or particularly want to speculate on the theological validity of that, but I'm hoping someday to see my sweet yellow Labrador Retriever, Nora, who I think is at this point more worthy of heaven than I am. But in any case, this again comes back to the question of whether original sin can be viewed in a type of gradation the way the Eastern Orthodox Church does. Augustine and Aquinas flatly deny that, but I'm raising this as a question. Now, the question I'm raising is, what exactly is original sin that only we have? Let's say we have it only. What is it? Well, clearly it's related to the fact that we have rational souls, as Thomas said. And it is related to the fact that we, in Adam, ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And I'm reluctant to use this term, but dagnabbit, I'm going to use it. It's existential guilt. And only humans and other rational creatures are capable of having existential guilt. It is a guilt simply for existing, and you have to be conscious in order to have that guilt. In his great novella, Metamorphosis, Kafka's protagonist, Gregor Samsa, is turned into a giant insect. He awoke one day and was turned into a giant insect. Now, forgive the biologist in me, but it's probably not a cockroach. The word he uses is ungeheures, ungeziefer, which refers to an unclean animal, one unsuitable even for sacrifice. But I want to point out this quote from Metamorphosis, and Gregor, as insect, tries to come out of his room, and his family pelts him back. And what do they throw at him? Apples. So he's making this into a metaphor for original sin, which is kind of interesting because Franz Kafka was Jewish, and I have it on reliable sources that Judaism does not have a doctrine of original sin. But in any case, and furthermore, the fruit was probably not an apple. It was probably more like a banana. But in any case, original sin. What is original sin? I think it is the becoming aware of ourselves as responsible and potentially guilty creatures. But do not despair. We chose badly, but it is perhaps, as Augustine also said, a happy fault, a felix culpa. Okay, next question. Is disease natural? And if so, in what way is it natural? Now, I've been talking about disease, bodily defects, as a failure of nature, but is that really true? For one thing, the medicine of Thomas's day was not especially effective, but what should the limits of our efforts in medicine be? But the fact is, some people think about living forever, and that's not our natural state right now. Transhumanism, this term coined by Julian Huxley. And you don't have to have it quite as bad as he did. There are these stores. I want to tell you, don't waste your money. But this is transhumanism is a type of dualism that even Descartes would have been ashamed of. Okay, last question. Given the success of biology and the other natural sciences, do we really need a concept of the soul anymore? And I'm not going to make this argument because I've written about it in articles and in other talks, but I think we need it now more than ever, as we need faith more than ever. But the problem is that we as scientists have to be careful not to contribute to the problem. And here is one such man contributing to the problem. In 1907, Dr. Duncan McDougall of Haverhill, Mass. Proposed to determine the weight of the soul. So he took patients who had tuberculosis. He put them on beds that were suspended on scales, and as they died, he measured the weight change. And he said, that must be the weight of the soul. Okay, so the science was bloody awful. He never heard of a control. But I would say that the bad science was the least of his problems. The real problem was bad metaphysics. He didn't know, as Thomas Aquinas told us 700 plus years earlier, that the soul cannot possibly be a body. You can't weigh it for that reason. So we have to be careful not to contribute to the problem. All right, last couple of quotes. This quote, Dostoevsky, if you ever read it, he has some interesting things to say about science, about how science, he wasn't anti-science, but he was worried about scientism, and this is in the mid-19th century. All right? Scientism, the belief that science can explain everything, and as he says, it doesn't lead to happiness. And the last thing I'm going to say is that it couldn't possibly lead to happiness because even Einstein knew that was the case. Gravitation is not responsible for people falling in love. And I'll end with a quote, another quote from Father Zosima in the Brothers Karamazov. And he's talking about Job. He's talking about his own spiritual development and spiritual formation. He's talking how important the book of Job is to him. God restores Job again, gives him wealth anew. Once more many years pass, and he has new children, different ones, and he loves them. Oh Lord, one thinks, but how could he so love these new ones when his former children are no more, when he has lost them? Remembering them, was it possible for him to be fully happy as he had been before with the new ones, however dear they might be to him? But it is possible, it is possible. The old grief, by a great mystery of human life, gradually passes into quiet, tender joy. Instead of young, ebullient blood, becomes a mild, serene old age. I bless the sun's rising each day, and my heart sings to it as before. But now I love its setting even more, its long slanting rays, and with them quiet, mild, tender memories, dear images from the whole of a long and blessed life. He says this on his deathbed. This weekend, I lost a good friend who was struggling with prostate cancer for a number of years. And he got chemotherapy and then got some newer experimental forms of therapy, but nevertheless died this past weekend of widespread metastatic prostate carcinoma. Now, in talking about Dostoevsky, I'm reminded of one important biographical fact, and that is that the hero of the novel, Alyosha, that's short for Alexei. It's a diminutive form of Alexei. And the narrator of the novel declares Alyosha right on the foreword of the novel to be the hero of the novel, albeit a rather odd and unusual one. Now, while Dostoevsky was writing The Brothers Karamazov, his 3-year-old son, Alexei, Alyosha, died. And so when I think about my friend who died, I cannot help thinking about my friend's wife, what she must be going through. And then I think that even worse than that, as horrible as that is, even worse than that must be the loss of a child. There can be no more devastating loss than the loss of a child. It was therefore an act of remarkable courage for Dostoevsky to write this passage in the words of the elder Zosima. Science can and should find cures for diseases whenever it can, but I do not think it can or should try to find a cure for mortality. And even if that is so, even if that's so, that we can't cure mortality and shouldn't cure mortality, I think it is still possible to find comfort, as Zosima did, in God's love. Thank you.